Welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. Today, I want to talk about faith in the public square. It used to be that, faith was quite welcome in Canada's public square. Maybe not so much over the last few decades. You've probably noticed that. So why is that? Where are we going from here? Also want to touch on assisted suicide. Okay, so our guest today, Dr. David Guretzki, joining us from Ottawa. He's the president of the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Their website, evangelicalfellowship.ca. Thanks for taking time for us here today.
Thanks, Paul. Good to be here with you.
You bet. Lots to talk about. For anyone watching who may not be familiar with the EFC, do you want to just briefly give us a snapshot of what you're all about?
I'd love to. The Evangelical Fellowship of Canada is the National Association of Evangelical Denominations, post-secondary schools and organizations and congregations. We represent somewhere around 7,500 congregations, about 45 to 48 denominations, bunch of schools, bunch of organizations. And we try to speak to matters of public policy. We do research on church and the faith in Canada. And we do all kinds of ministry partnerships and publications and podcasts and ways to help equip Christians who want to understand the issues of the day.
I wanted to start, David, here with the recent controversial recommendations that came from the Federal Finance Committee. That would be removing charitable tax status from churches and pro-life groups. And I kind of went tilt, going, really? Going, okay. So now, of course, Parliament has been prorogued, so I'm thinking those would die on the table here, but you're suggesting, well, it's possible it could still sneak through, if the government isn't brought down right away once they reconvene.
Right. Yeah, there are these two recommendations. There's a stack of recommendations that came through to the Finance Committee. I think there was about 462 or so recommendations, and these come from consultations right across the country, and people can put in, organizations can put in their recommendations and so on. And these two particular recommendations actually came in almost verbatim from the BC Humanist Association that had submitted a report to the Finance Committee. So these recommendations can come forward to the Finance Committee as they're working on budgets and so on. It doesn't mean that the recommendations are all followed, but that certainly comes into play as the government is preparing budgets. So these two particular recommendations, they're actually recommendation number 429, which says that they recommending that there should be no longer charitable status to anti-abortion organizations. And then number 430, which is recommending amending the Income Tax Act to remove advancement of religion as a charitable cause in Canada. So these two, of course, they're of great concern. They just because the budget, there might be another budget when Parliament resumes. Those could be taken into context. If the government persists, that could come through into the next budget. If the government weren't to persist, then of course those wouldn't come through. But the important thing to understand is once they're on the books, there's been this suggestion. Right now, there's this public suggestion that these are two recommendations that are live. They may not actually be invoked or used in the immediate future, but now they're part of the public conversation. And so I think we're going to have to just be aware that even if it doesn't happen in this budget, it could be in a budget or two or three down the line.
Yeah, certainly we need to be aware that there is some sentiment in Canada to some degree, and to see this removed from churches, and again, not necessarily only Christian churches. This would cover, I think, all religious, organizations. Right. I'm assuming. So I think there would be a fair bit of pushback. Now, on the one hand, I was chatting with a fellow Christian the other day, and does this mean we should stop giving, right? Because we don't get a tax receipt. I mean, we should be giving regardless of getting a tax receipt or not, right? Out of the goodness of our hearts, obeying the Lord and so forth. But there is something to be said. I mean, when you look at all the good that is coming to Canada from the various religious organizations across this country, should we not be rewarding that and encouraging people to give? Just seems to make sense, right?
Right, yeah. And I mean, there are places, there are many places in the world where, there are no tax benefits to giving to charities.
Yep.
But I think what needs to be highlighted here is that even if an organization like a church is their primary charitable object is about the advancement of religion, we know that that's not just simply about teaching, or it often includes all kinds of other activities. Caring for homeless,
Yeah.
caring for mothers, caring for people who are new to the country and are learning English. There's all kinds of services that religious organizations and churches do under the banner of advancing religion, that aren't just simply about worship and doctrinal beliefs and so on. There's always a much broader, what some have called kind of a halo effect to the broader
Yeah.
communities.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's why there's even people who aren't particularly religious who donate to these organizations because they see the good that's
Yeah.
taking place. So, and the other question is, I guess, why single out pro-life groups? Again, we may disagree on whether abortion is a good thing or not a good thing. However, to, I guess, argue against the work that some of these groups are doing, for example, like helping single moms, find a place to live, providing things that they need, encouraging an adoption, are those bad things? I think most people would say that's actually maybe a good thing, right?
Right. Well, that's a difficult question to answer because, of course, the current government has had as a plank of their policy about being a pro-choice party, and so I mean I think that's a natural outflow of their approach. Now, remember,
Right.
these are recommendations; these aren't things that the government has yet adopted. So,
Right. Yeah.
but it does align with the party platform that has actually been pretty publicly evident in the last several terms.
Well, we're living in times, it seems, where there's a societal pressure to think alike on social and moral issues, right? So, and if we debate or discuss it and disagree with the current narrative, then, there's this cancel culture thing. We're going to shun you and push you off to the side. You're not welcome into the public square. And so, where do you think that's headed in Canada?
Well, that's an interesting way to frame it, because I think that the temptation can be, when we hear about, like what you say, the cancel culture, the natural human tendency, I think, for all of us, whether we're religious or Christian or not, is our kind of flesh kind of pushes back and say, well, you can't, if you're going to cancel me, I'll cancel you.
Right.
And I think we have to, it is a spiritual issue that we're dealing with. We always have to remember we're not dealing with flesh and blood. We're dealing with principalities and powers, with ideas and ideologies. And so I think that as Christians, we have to resist the temptation to kind of react to these types of pressures, and engage in a way that's winsome, engage in a way that's reasonable and respectful, and actually just demonstrate and live out a different way of having public debates and public discussions on issues that clearly we don't all agree in Canada at a moral kind of level. There's all kinds of different moral narratives that are at play. I think the big important thing is, how do we actually engage? Not so much even what we say, but how do we engage in these issues? And do we do it in a different way
Mm-hmm.
than what's the standard kind of ways of engaging? I think
Yep.
that the polarization of our culture, both here in Canada, and certainly we see that in our neighbors to the south, we actually have to find ways to not fall into that same kind of polarization, and find another way. I think of First Peter chapter 3, where Peter says, "Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope you have." And he says, "Do it with gentleness and respect." And I think those two words
Absolutely.
go a long ways. If we can do what we do with reasonableness, ready to give an answer, we need to be prepared, but doing it in the fruit of the Spirit, with gentleness and with respect. We may not always, our reasons may not always be heard, but I think it's more important that we engage in a spirit-filled way, a spiritually fruitful kind of way, than a reactive way.
I would totally agree with that. I think people are somewhat shocked and refreshed when they get that kind of a response. That's kind. Well, let's switch gears here for a moment. I know you wanted to talk about assisted suicide, MAID, medical assistance in dying. Now, the federal government recently launching a national conversation about allowing advance requests for MAID. Now, maybe explain to us, first of all, what is exactly an advance request for MAID?
Right. Well, it's probably best to start from the current situation. The way that legislation is relative to MAID is that it's currently required that a person who's receiving MAID, assisted suicide or euthanasia, has to in the moments before it occurs has to give assent and consent to the procedure.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this we kind of see that as a critical safeguard, right? That in the last minute, legally, a person is required to say, yes, I do give consent to this. This is not what we wish how it would be, but that's the current legal
Mm-hmm.
situation. And what's being asked of government is to consider cases where people might be have some kind of disease or some kind of illness where clearly at some point they're going to lose their ability to give us consent in the moment. And so an advance request is to say, given the malady that I have, the illness or disease that I have, it's inevitable that I'm going to be able to, I'm going to lose my ability to consent, well before I might want to die. And so the push for advance request is to be able to say, legally, I want to be able to say, when I lose my ability to speak, or I lose my ability to do this, or however it's set up, that a person would be able to receive assisted suicide or euthanasia without having to give consent in the moment. That's what an advance request. So it's a legal, sort of advanced notification meeting certain kind of requirements, a certain kind of situation
Mm-hmm.
where the procedure would be done without the person actually having to consent in the moment. That's really what we're talking about. Should that be
Right.
allowed? That's the
Yeah. That's well.
conversation.
It's got some problems attached to it for sure.
Yeah.
And I should mention. So this national conversation the government is launching here includes an online questionnaire. They want to hear what the public thinks about this, and that's open to the public until Valentine's Day, February 14th. And I believe there's a link on your website there. So evangelicalfellowship.ca. And people, should I think participate in that.
Yes.
Make your voice count, right? So
Yep.
I mean, so we have this advance request thing here, which now is this illegal in Canada?
Yep.
Somehow it's not. There's some safeguards I think in place. Although apparently Quebec is now, and again healthcare being provincial, they're kind of separating themselves from the federal oversight here, and they're now doing this, right?
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. There are
Okay.
two things to consider. There is the Quebec situation. So the inability to the current legal restriction against giving advance consent to MAID is covered under the criminal code. So that's federally. You
Right.
have to be able to give consent in the moment. Because healthcare is provincially driven, it's provincially regulated. What Quebec has decided to do is to allow for advance requests, and basically they've just said that the attorney general or the provincial attorney general will not prosecute medical professionals who accept an advance request under the criminal code. They won't prosecute them under the existing criminal code. They're basically invoking their provincial right. Perhaps almost like a notwithstanding to say we're not going
Mm-hmm.
to prosecute people. It's still illegal though. It's still illegal under the criminal code.
Right. So
All Quebec has
technically,
said is that they're saying they're not going to prosecute.
right. I
You know,
guess the RCMP, could, prosecute somebody here, enforce the law, but that they're not doing so, it looks
right?
like.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
very interesting.
yeah.
It brings up a lot of
There,
interesting.
Yeah,
I
and
was,
the other side of this is that, of course, there is a bill that was raised at Senate. It's Bill S-248. It was a
mhm.
Senate bill that was also arguing and advocating for allowing advance MAID requests. And that bill now, because of the prorogation of Parliament, will die on the floor. It hadn't even, I don't think, had actually gotten to committee. But we have to remember that just because the bill dies in a prorogued Parliament doesn't mean that it can't be revived.
Yep.
So a bill, whether it comes from the House of Commons or from the Senate, could be revived. If there's enough interest and there's it gets put onto the docket, that could easily be revived without too much debate. So it's dead. It's technically dead under the prorogued Parliament, but that doesn't mean it's gone. It's necessarily
Right.
gone.
Okay.
I almost certainly it's not gone. It will be re-raised at some point, and especially because it's coming from the Senate. This is not necessarily dependent upon the current government. The Senate itself,
Right.
can bring bills forward as well.
Okay.
So that's another thing that we need to be aware of, and we have spoken to that bill also on our website if you want to talk, see a little
Yeah.
bit more about it.
Oh, for sure. And I encourage people to check it out, evangelicalfellowship.ca. And you have an article there as well. I think it's something like top, or 10 reasons, why, reasons to oppose advance requests for MAID here. And, one of the points you bring out there is, people change their minds. That's a great point because, so if somebody's now lost the capacity to think for themselves and they've got dementia or something like that, and they've put an advance request in, but now they are not able to function properly in their mind. Well, what if they have changed their mind? Sometimes people in dementia come and go, but now you're at the point where the person is going to have their life ended by a medical professional. They can't give consent, and maybe inside they're wanting to say no, but they can't. And right.
Yeah, and so even if someone doesn't, if someone actually changes their mind but loses their ability to communicate, loses their ability to move or to speak, even if they did change their mind, they may not have the physical ability to actually voice it, and so that's certainly another kind of issue. I think that there are those 10 reasons that we've listed on our website, but another one that for me is just really, really important for us to understand is the issue of the conflict of interest that this introduces, potential conflicts of interest. Because if a person does an advance request for MAID and then loses their ability to consent in the moment, someone has to make a decision about when that happens. And so then it becomes a question: is it the doctor? Is it the medical professional?
Do they need an extra bed at the hospital,
Yep.
right? That sort of thing. And
or is it the family? And I've often highlighted that one of the really troubling aspects about medical assistance in dying is that in these types of cases, particularly, we do know where there's divided families. There's maybe some family members who are completely in favor of the person who is asked for MAID, but there might be others who are devastated and destroyed by this idea that their mother or father or their grandfather or grandmother or whoever, their sibling, has chosen this, but they have no ability to actually speak into it. So then the real question becomes: what if when the person is given advance consent, like who makes the decision as to when this actually happens, right? And someone has to make that decision. And now, is it going to be a decision of a doctor against patients? Is it going to pit the doctor against family? So I think that's another critical aspect that certainly we're concerned about. But fundamentally, it goes back to the whole MAID legislation right from the start has been built upon this idea of consent. Even though the EFC has opposed medical assistance in dying and euthanasia-assisted suicide right from the start, it's been built upon this idea that a person has to have the personal autonomy to be able to make this decision. And I think that there's some problems with overreaching upon the sort of the sovereignty of the individual, and yet here we're actually seeing this sort of paradoxical reversal, where on the one hand the person it's all been built upon the ability of the person to consent, but now we're at a point where with an advanced request, in the moment the person can't consent. In the moment.
Absolutely.
Right?
That's
And
crucial.
so it seems to me a little bit of a paradox going on there, where on the one hand we say you must be able to consent, and on the other hand we're saying, well, there's times when you can't consent, so someone else needs to make the decision.
Yeah, it's definitely problematic. I mean, we need to speak up on this one. We have an opportunity now, if there's a
Yep.
national conversation going on. So, we do need to contact our senators, our members of parliament. Um, you know, uh, and again, there's an online survey, right? So
Right.
check
Yep.
it out again, evangelicalfellowship.ca until February 14th. This is literally a life and death situation for many, many people.
Yep.
So go ahead.
Particularly in light of Paul, that certainly there's going to be an election this year as
Yeah,
well in
yeah,
October, at least by October,
yeah,
and I mean there could be election earlier, and I think
for
this
sure.
is an opportunity for all of us as citizens to be able to contact our MPs, to have conversations with candidates, asking them what their positions are on various issues like MAID,
Mm-hmm,
like
mm-hmm.
the charitable status. We can ask these types of questions. That's our responsibilities, I think,
Yes.
and opportunities as citizens living in Canada. And so I think there's an important season here where some of these issues, which maybe felt like bygone conclusions, because an election is coming forward, they can be raised with a freshness,
Mm-hmm.
especially with candidates, right? Not only
Yes.
with MPs, but with candidates who are seeking our votes, right? So this is an opportunity for us to engage in the public square. And again, I just say, do it with respectfulness, do it
Yep.
with reasonableness,
Yep.
gentleness, and kindness. I think that's a better way to approach it. We don't want to get into shouting matches. We don't want to
No.
get into accusations, attacks against the person, but let's keep focused on the issue. Let's ask these questions. I think this is a good way for Christians to engage in the public square.
Is an opportune time right now, as an election approaches, for sure. So, tied in with this, what is happening with religious freedoms for faith-based hospitals and seniors' residences and so forth? Are they, being denied funding if they refuse to provide medical assistance in dying?
So it's getting quite complicated. There is, for example, a case in BC, St. Paul's Hospital, which is run by the Providence Healthcare, and they're a Catholic
Yeah.
hospital, and they have been a MAID free zone. They don't practice MAID on the facility,
Mm-hmm.
and that's their stance as a Catholic organization. And so they've actually been taken to court. They're being
Yeah.
challenged in a court case where a woman who was at the hospital who wanted MAID, but of course wasn't able to take it at that hospital. And so in her transfer to the hospital is certainly willing to transfer her to another organization that would do it, or another hospital that would do it.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, she lost consciousness and didn't regain consciousness. And so they're
Mm-hmm.
taking St. Paul's to court over this, and
Yeah.
challenging them why a hospital that at least certainly partially receives public funding for healthcare, why they're allowed to not participate in MAID, right? And I
Yeah.
think this is similar kinds of thing like with abortion as well. They would also take the stance that they don't participate in abortions as well. And so this is a challenge to their status. It's a charter challenge. It's almost certainly going to wend its way through to the Supreme Court at some point. It's probably a long process. But yeah, it's really raising the question, to what extent can organizations, not just individuals, have a conscientious objection to MAID or to abortion or so on, but to what extent can organizations like a
Yeah.
hospital hold to a conscientious position such as against MAID? That's really what this case is. I think is going to challenge. It's going to challenge the rights and freedoms of the individual versus the rights and freedoms of the organization.
Yeah, and it's a little bit discouraging when you look back at the Supreme Court decision on Trinity Western University, right, and the the law societies and so forth, and their religious beliefs, and religious rights seem to fall to the bottom of that rights panel, and so if that's the precedent, might be
Yeah,
in for a tough go on this one, but we'll see where it goes.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And again, faith. What is our place in the public square right now? We've got to do it with grace and with kindness and so forth. And I think it's got to be a grassroots from the bottom up, right? So, any final thoughts on this and where it's going here, Dr. Guretzki?
So I think what all I want to say is that when we're engaged in public square debates upon various issues that touch on morality and conscience and so on, I mean, we recognize that a lot of these are coming from a religious perspective, and from the EFC's perspective, we have to remember that our desire to advocate and ensure that there's religious liberty for Christians can't stop there, because as I've often said, religious freedom that isn't for all isn't religious freedom at all. And so we have to remember that this is not just a battle of Christians only, but this is actually an issue that touches anybody who has any kind of religious faith. Because if religious freedom isn't for all, then none of us really truly have religious freedom. And so we have to make sure that we're making the cases for these, not just on the basis of who we are as Christians, but also on the basis of anyone who holds to any kind of religious belief or even non-religious belief that they have a strong conscience
Got to
on.
leave it there, but well said.
Yep.
Appreciate it. Dr. David Guretzki, our guest today, evangelicalfellowship.ca. Do check it out and participate in that online survey, if at all possible. Check out WizeUp.ca, or you can watch the show at app.corcoplus.com. God bless.